Imagine walking down the street when someone asks you for $1. What would you do? Well, when J.D. Vance found himself in that exact situation, his response wasn't what anyone expected. What happened next left an entire crowd speechless. The neon "Open 24 hours" sign flickered against the rain-slicked pavement, casting a dull glow outside Marge's Diner, a roadside staple on the edge of a small Kentucky town. Inside, the air was thick with the scent of bacon grease, coffee, and old leather booths, a familiar comfort to the regulars who had been coming here for years. The steady hum of a jukebox in the corner mixed with the occasional clink of silverware against plates, creating a quiet rhythm of late-night normalcy. At the counter, Marge, the diner's owner, a woman in her 60s with a no-nonsense attitude but a soft spot for hard-luck cases, wiped down the counter with practiced ease. A few truckers sat in the back booth, talking in low voices over steaming mugs of coffee, their eyes occasionally flicking up toward the rain-speckled windows. A lone traveler scrolled through his phone, waiting for a meal, while an older man played solitaire with bent playing cards at the far end of the counter. Then, the door swung open with a faint creak, letting in a gust of cool, damp air. J.D. Vance stepped inside, shaking off the rain from his jacket. Dressed casually in a worn button-up and jeans, he looked like any other traveler passing through, but some of the regulars recognized him instantly. A few whispered his name, indifferent to his presence. Vance took a seat at the counter, nodding a polite greeting to Marge. He wasn't here for attention, just a quiet meal before heading back to his hotel. But before he could even place his order, the presence of a man near the entrance, a thin, tired figure in an old jacket, changed everything. Charlie hovered near the entrance, his shoulders hunched against the cold, his jacket a patchwork of wear and tear. He had been standing there for a while, undecided, watching the rain slide down the diner's windows. The few coins in his pocket weren't enough for a cup of coffee, but he had done this before. Asked for just enough to get by, nothing more. Some nights, Marge would slip him a leftover meal, but he hated relying on charity. He shifted his weight, glancing at the customers inside. Truckers sipping coffee, a traveler checking his phone, an old man lost in a game of solitaire, and then J.D. Vance sitting at the counter, casually flipping through the menu. Charlie recognized him immediately, not just from the news but from his book, his speeches about growing up poor. He had watched enough of them to wonder if the guy was the real deal or just another politician who talked big. Charlie swallowed his pride and took a slow step forward. His boots scuffed against the floor, damp from the rain. He wasn't loud, wasn't aggressive, just tired. "Sir, could you spare $1?" The diner seemed to still for a moment. A truck driver glanced up, his brows slightly raised. The man playing solitaire paused mid-move, pretending not to listen. Marge wiped down the counter more slowly, her eyes flicking between Charlie and Vance. Vance looked up, meeting Charlie's gaze. No immediate reaction, no hurried reach for his wallet. Instead, he studied Charlie's face. The deep lines of exhaustion, the slight tremor in his hands. Charlie shifted uncomfortably under the scrutiny, already bracing for a polite rejection, a dismissive shake of the head. That's how it usually went. People either ignored him or tossed him loose change without a second glance. But J.D. Vance didn't do either. Instead, he did something that made Charlie hesitate, made the entire diner seem to lean in closer. He asked, "What's your name?" Charlie hesitated for a moment, taken aback by the simple question. It wasn't what he had expected, especially not from someone like Vance. Most people just handed over $1 and moved on, barely sparing a glance. But Vance wasn't doing that. Instead, he was looking at him, waiting, giving him space to speak. "Charlie?" he finally muttered, his voice low, as if his name might be too heavy to say out loud. Vance nodded thoughtfully. "Charlie, how long have you been out here?" His tone was calm, almost casual, as if they were simply talking about the weather, not the harsh realities of life on the streets. Charlie shifted on his feet, trying to find the right words. "Too long," he muttered, glancing away. He wasn't used to talking about it. It wasn't easy to explain to someone who had never experienced it, the constant struggle to survive, to find work, to scrape by. "A couple years, I guess." Vance didn't rush him. "What did you do before all this?" For a moment, Charlie thought he might walk away, leaving the question unanswered, but instead, he found himself speaking before he even knew what to say. "I was a coal miner," he said, the words coming out like an old wound being reopened. "Plumber mostly, fixing leaks, working for local contractors. But when the mines closed and the jobs dried up, well, that was it. Couldn't get any steady work after that." Vance didn't interrupt, his eyes steady, listening. "You ever try getting back on your feet? Find work?" he asked gently. Charlie scoffed, the bitterness creeping into his voice. "You think it's that easy? You think someone's gonna hire me without an address? Without a phone? I tried. Shelters, temp jobs. They want you to have a place, a phone, everything. But you can't get any of that if you don't have a job to start with." For a long moment there was only the quiet hum of the diner and the soft clink of cutlery. Charlie felt the weight of Vance's gaze and something inside him started to soften, just a little. This wasn't the usual judgment he had grown so used to. Vance wasn't just a guy handing out $1, he was listening, and for the first time in a long while, Charlie began to think maybe, just maybe, someone could help him, beyond just a meal or spare change. The moment between Vance and Charlie seemed to stretch on, but the quiet atmosphere was soon broken by a voice from the back of the diner. The man in the flannel shirt, a regular who had been sitting in the corner with a cup of coffee, let out a low chuckle, shaking his head as he crossed his arms. "Look at this," he said, his voice tinged with skepticism. "A politician talking to a homeless guy like this is some kind of charity event. What's next, gonna give him a house, too?" The laughter that followed from a few of the truckers nearby made Charlie shift uncomfortably, but Vance didn't flinch. He remained calm, his expression unreadable as he kept his focus on Charlie. The man in the flannel continued, now addressing the whole diner. "We all know what happens here. Politicians come in, throw around some sympathy, act like they care, then walk away and forget all about it." Others in the diner, still leaning in and watching, murmured in agreement. Some gave Charlie side glances, almost pitying him, while others just seemed to roll their eyes, convinced this was yet another political stunt. The skepticism was palpable, the air thick with doubt that anything genuine could come from a politician talking to someone like Charlie. Vance took a breath and turned to face the man in flannel, his voice steady but cutting through the doubt. "I'm not here for a photo op, or to play the part of a savior," he said, his eyes never wavering. "I'm here because I think people like Charlie deserve more than the brush-off or the charity. What they need is a real shot, not empty promises." Charlie watched the exchange closely, his hands gripping the edges of the counter, uncertain whether to feel hopeful or defensive. But Vance didn't raise his voice. He didn't try to argue or justify his actions. He simply stayed calm and said what was true, and something in the room shifted. Some of the skepticism began to fade, replaced by curiosity. Was this actually something different? Could a simple offer, a phone number, a chance, be more valuable than $1? The man in the flannel remained unconvinced, but stayed silent, and for the first time in what felt like ages, Charlie felt the weight of the decision shift from him to the crowd. He didn't have to prove himself to anyone else. Vance stood up straight, his expression unwavering as he shifted the conversation. "I'm not going to give you $1, he said simply, looking directly at Charlie, his voice steady. The words landed in the diner like a slow, deliberate wave. There was no hesitation, no awkward pause. Vance wasn't handing out a quick fix. He was offering something deeper. Charlie blinked, confused for a moment. He was used to the quick exchanges, the pity, the handouts, the fleeting kindnesses that came with no strings attached. But this felt different, like something more real was at stake. Vance reached into his coat pocket and pulled out a small, folded piece of paper. He extended it toward Charlie, who eyed the paper suspiciously, his tired eyes darting between the paper and Vance's face. The skeptical voice in the diner started murmuring, some of the regulars shaking their heads, whispering, "What's he doing? This isn't some charity event." They weren't wrong. This wasn't the usual dynamic. But Vance didn't care about appearances. He was here for something more than that. "It's a name and a number," Vance said, holding it out. "A guy I know runs a construction company. He's always looking for workers, especially for people willing to start fresh. Charlie glanced down at the piece of paper, the crumpled edges in his hand feeling like a lifeline. His fingers trembled slightly as he held it, the skepticism in his chest warring with something else, something he hadn't felt in a long time. Hope. The murmurs from the diner grew louder. The regulars looked around at each other, unsure what to make of this. "This sounds like a scam," someone muttered. "People like him don't just get a second shot." Charlie wasn't so sure either. He stared at the paper for a moment, his grip tightening as he considered the weight of the offer. "I'm not promising you anything," Vance said, seeing the doubt in Charlie's face. "But this is a real chance, a job, a shot. You take it or leave it." Charlie swallowed hard. He had heard promises before, the kind that never amounted to anything. But this time, something felt different. He wasn't being handed a crumpled bill to get by for one more day. Vance wasn't looking for gratitude or praise. Instead, he was giving Charlie the one thing that had been out of reach for too long: a way out. Charlie hesitated, eyeing the paper one last time. Finally, he took it, his hand shaking, but his heart pounding with a mix of disbelief and cautious optimism. This wasn't $1. It was a chance. Charlie stood frozen, the small piece of paper clutched tightly in his hand, as the murmurs in the diner grew louder. His eyes flickered between the phone number written on it and the faces of the onlookers. For a long moment, he didn't move. The weight of the decision hung in the air like a thick fog. The skepticism of the crowd, the judgment in their eyes, felt like a tangible presence around him. He had been in this position before. Promises, hopes, all of them crushed by the harsh reality of his life on the streets. People like him didn't get second chances. That's what he had always believed, and that belief had kept him from taking any real risks. The flannel-shirted man from earlier was still watching, his arms crossed, his face locked in a skeptical scowl. "You really going to take that?" he sneered. "You think some phone number is going to change anything?" His words hit harder than Charlie expected, like a sharp jab to a bruise that had never healed. It was the kind of doubt Charlie had heard his whole life, the kind that made him feel like he didn't belong in a world that worked for others. "What makes you think this time will be different?" Charlie's throat tightened as he stared at the paper again. It wasn't just a job. It was a possibility, a shot at a life he thought he had lost forever. But the fear, the crippling doubt, threatened to swallow him whole. What if it didn't work out? What if he showed up and was rejected again? What if this was just another false hope, another empty promise wrapped in false kindness? "You've been let down before," he muttered under his breath. "Why trust him now?" The internal battle raged on, as Charlie's mind replayed the failures, the moments when he had hoped and lost, the countless times he had tried and failed. But then, something shifted inside him, a spark of defiance, a desire to prove the world wrong. Vance wasn't just giving him $1 to get by, he was offering a chance to change, and Charlie realized this might be the first time in years he had been given something worth fighting for. With a shaky breath, Charlie looked up at Vance, whose calm demeanor seemed unshaken by the doubt swirling around them. Charlie's grip tightened on the paper as he finally made the decision. This wasn't just about a job, it was about proving to himself that he wasn't beyond saving, beyond help. With a slight nod, Charlie tucked the paper into his pocket, the first step in reclaiming his life, one that he never thought he'd take. The room was silent, the weight of the decision pressing down on Charlie's shoulders. He stood there, the phone number in his hand, unsure whether to hold on to his long-standing skepticism or take the leap and trust that this was more than just a fleeting gesture. A few seconds stretched into what felt like an eternity, as the murmurs around him continued. But the noise felt distant, muffled, as if the diner had faded into the background. The only thing that mattered now was the small burner phone in his hand. Charlie's fingers trembled slightly, but he wasn't sure if it was from the cold or from the tension in the air. The man in the flannel shirt still stared at him, a mixture of disbelief and contempt written on his face. "What are you waiting for?" he snapped, his voice harsh. "You really think it'll be any different this time?" Charlie's heart pounded in his chest. It felt as if the world had narrowed down to this single moment, this single choice. A chance for something real, something he had almost given up on. For a moment he thought about walking away, about shoving the phone back into Vance's hand and retreating back into the familiar, the easy, the place where he didn't have to risk failure or disappointment. But deep down, he knew it wasn't just about taking a phone number. It was about taking control of something he had lost long ago, his future. "What have I got to lose?" Charlie muttered to himself. He looked up at Vance, who was standing calmly, offering no pressure, just waiting. There was something genuine in Vance's eyes, something that made Charlie feel like maybe, just maybe, this time it could be different. With a deep breath, he reached into his pocket and pulled out the paper, folding it carefully before slipping it into his jacket. Then slowly, with the kind of resolve he hadn't felt in years, he reached for the phone. The crowd watched in stunned silence, their earlier cynicism dissipating as they saw something shift in Charlie's posture. A sense of hope that hadn't been there moments before. Charlie took the phone from Vance's hand, his fingers brushing against Vance's, and for the first time in a long while, he felt the faintest flicker of possibility. This wasn't just about a phone, it was about a future. Charlie's fingers closed around the phone, the weight of it still unfamiliar, like an anchor or a lifeline. He wasn't entirely sure which. The eyes of the diner's customers felt like a heavy presence as they watched him, but Charlie didn't look up. Instead, he tucked the phone into his pocket, the feeling of it pressing against his chest like a promise, or maybe a question. What would he do next? The doubt lingered, as it always did. He had been here before, standing at the edge of hope, only to be let down again. The man in the flannel shirt muttered something under his breath, still unconvinced, but Charlie blocked him out, focusing on the faintest glimmer of possibility that had crept into his heart. The sound of the diner, the chatter, the clinking of coffee cups, the low hum of conversations, seemed to fade as Charlie took his first step toward the door. The walk felt heavier than usual, his feet dragging slightly as the weight of his own uncertainty pressed against him. He wasn't sure if he was walking toward something or just away from the same old life. As he reached the door, he hesitated, glancing back over his shoulder toward the counter. Vance was still standing there, arms folded, watching him quietly. There was no applause, no fanfare, just a quiet acknowledgement that something had shifted, though Charlie couldn't quite place what. As Charlie walked down the dimly lit street, the phone still heavy in his pocket, he couldn't shake the feeling that this moment had taught him something deeper than he realized. For years he had lived in a world where money was the answer, where a dollar here and there was the only thing that could momentarily alleviate the crushing weight of poverty. It was easier to take the quick, simple fixes, a few bucks for a coffee, a meal, and keep moving. But what had just happened in that diner, what Vance had offered him, wasn't just a dollar. It was a chance, a possibility. It was the recognition that he was worth more than just a temporary handout. The phone, the contact, the potential job. It wasn't just about the material aid. It was about someone taking the time to see him for who he truly was. Beyond the disheveled clothes and the tired eyes, someone had finally seen the man, not the label. Charlie's thoughts kept circling back to the people in the diner, the crowd that had watched with skepticism. They were quick to assume that Vance's offer was just another political stunt, or that Charlie's situation was a result of his own laziness or poor decisions. But what Vance had done was acknowledge the complexity of Charlie's story, his struggles, his past, and the hurdles that had kept him stuck in a loop of survival. Vance hadn't given him money to make it through the night, he had given him a chance to stand up. The lesson Charlie was learning now was that real change doesn't come from a quick fix. It comes from giving someone the opportunity to show that they can contribute, that they can rise above their circumstances if just given a little help and a bit of respect. The next morning, Charlie didn't feel like a man just waiting for another dollar. He felt like someone who could make a decision. Maybe it was the first time in years he felt like he wasn't a charity case. That small piece of paper in his pocket was more than just a phone number. It was proof that he wasn't invisible. The lesson was simple, yet profound. Kindness goes beyond a handout. Sometimes it's about offering the dignity of a chance, letting someone prove that they can rise and find a way out of their circumstances. It was the beginning of his journey to change, and for the first time, Charlie believed it might actually be possible. The story of J.D. Vance and Charlie Evans is more than just an exchange between a man with resources and a man in need. It is a lesson about seeing people for who they are, not just what they appear to be. In a world where it's easier to ignore someone struggling on the streets, Vance chose to ask instead of assume, listen instead of dismiss. Charlie's request for $1 was simple, but Vance saw past the surface. He understood that what people truly need isn't just a handout, but a chance. $1 might buy a cup of coffee, but an opportunity could change a life. Instead of offering temporary relief, Vance sought to understand Charlie's story, offering something more valuable than spare change: respect, dignity, and the possibility of something better. This story reminds us that real change begins with conversation and compassion, sometimes the smallest acts. Asking someone's name, listening to their story, seeing them as more than their circumstances, can create the biggest impact. It's not just about generosity, it's about recognizing the humanity in every person and being willing to give more than what's easy.